Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about becoming a better storyteller. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with GoToWebinar's control panel, which hopefully you'll have on your screen, and you can ask questions. Just pop them up in the question panel, and I will get to them as we go through the webinar. So don't hesitate popping a question up or a comment as we go on. That's totally fine, and we will answer them. I'll answer them as we go. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll be talking about storytelling, which is becoming increasingly important in terms of communications. And as we know, people are talking about content and how you use stories in terms of campaigning and public relations, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about today, and how we deploy that in a better way, in a more constructive, creative way. So let me just get, sorry, here we go. So essentially today we're going to be looking at how to use stories to promote your business or organisation, and there's a whole range of ways we're going to be thinking about it, and breaking it down to the ways you write, the sort of ups and downs that you might include in a story, what sort of stories to include, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have some clearer thoughts on how to deploy stories for what you do. So I think the interesting thing about storytelling is it really does reflect a sort of development in the digital landscape. You know, we're all seeing at the moment all sorts of different things that are being thrown at us in terms of digital campaigning and PR and marketing. We're looking at augmented reality with things like Pokemon Go, which is an example, but it's not obviously not the only one. We're looking at virtual reality, but increasingly a lot of people, and you will hear this said, that you need to have better stories to engage people. People really don't just want to engage with 140 characters. They don't want to just engage with a very clinical statement of fact. They're interested in understanding, empathizing, relating to human beings, because fundamentally we're human beings and we want to be able to talk to other human beings about things that we're doing and thinking and feeling. So really, I suppose storytelling is a really different way of doing business, and means organizations, companies and brands have to know their target audiences, recognize their interests, and be creative to develop compelling stories. Sorry, I just lost the page there. Sorry. To develop compelling stories, to win over the people that you're trying to get on your team. You're trying to encourage people to support you, go out and act for you, buy something from you, activate for you. And how do you do that? I think no longer can you tell them that they need to just do it. They need to do it for a reason, and it's not just because it's going to make them feel better, be healthier, be whatever. It's got to be for, you've got to give them some really clear examples of stories that will lead them to that activation. And I think that's where storytelling comes in. So what we're going to cover today is a few things. Why storytelling is an effective promotional tool for your business or organization, how storytelling works, and how to create stories that are inspiring, memorable, and shareable. The kinds of stories that are inspiring, that build brand loyalty and nurture third-party supporters, and where and how you can actually use storytelling, because obviously you can't do it all the time, but there's a lot of times that you can use it. So, why use storytelling in the first place? Well, I think, there's a couple of, there's lots of profound statements and quotes about storytelling, but I think one of the ones that I came across is a good one. After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. By Philip Pullman said that, and it's actually very true if you think about it. What is it that we do when we sit down to talk to people? What is it that we do when we talk to our families? What is it that we do when we observe something? We tell stories about what we saw, what we felt, what we experienced. We tell stories about our family, about ourselves, about others. Um, Even, you think about the experiences that you have online and Facebook, you retell stories that you see there. They might be, compelling emotional stories. They may be something that angered you, upset you, inspired you, but you will often say, retell that story or tell someone that you saw that at some stage. So if you think about how we live and how we communicate, we really do talk in and about stories a great deal of the time, and I think that's really one of the reasons why stories are important. And so, if you think about how we're using social media, we've been using it now for a while, and I think if you look at the successful, companies and organizations that use it really well and inspire people and grow their support base, both companies and organizations, it is people who have used stories really well and inspired people, and often that's accompanied by photos to really drive that attention and that sort of focus. Um, and that leads me on to the next point. People relate to stories. Thomas King said the truth about stories is that's all we are, and that is very true. I mean, you talk about, often tell people about my grandparents or my mother or my father or my brother or my children or my husband, and really, or something that I did when I was at school or at university or whatever it is, and often they're amusing, they're sad, they're poignant, they're whatever they are, but they're stories. If you think about it, that is very true. Through stories about people like yourselves, like them, your potential customers, um, or clients have a vicarious experience. They live through those stories vicariously, and what you're offering them, they can try it out for themselves before they actually engage with it. So they get to see that you've helped this amazing, beautiful, wonderful person to do something, and you can hear that story through that first-hand experience. You can see someone talking about a product or an experience they've had with your company or with a particular product, and that is a story that's going to motivate them to engage and do it themselves. People learn from stories. Storytelling, Hannah Arendt says, and you've probably all heard of her, storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. So again, that is quite true. You don't have to exactly say precisely what it is you want your story to say. You just tell a story, and it leads people to interpret and to learn from those stories. And people learn from things in different ways, and they interpret from things from different ways. And that's really what that means, I suppose, in some respects. And people remember stories. Stories inspire word of mouth advertising. Stories drive a really memorable connection, and that's very, very true. And if you think about, stories, my children will often say, "Yeah, I've heard that story before, Mum. You've told me that before." In my mind, it's a memorable story. I might have told them about a funny story of when I used to work as a bra fitter at David Jones, and this is a bit deviating from reality here, but I've got some amusing anecdotes from when I did that, and I suppose that there's no particular, that doesn't really lead in any direction, but I will tell stories and I will retell them because they're in my mind as a sort of slightly amusing anecdote about something that I've done once, and I suppose they really do remember them in many respects, I think. So I think it is, when people retell those stories, it is a word of mouth. It is really word of mouth advertising for you. It is, in many respects, I suppose, it's pyramid selling. in a positive way. People make decisions based on emotion and experiences, not on facts, and that is, quite true. I mean, probably not in terms of buying a washing machine. Although if you think about it, I don't know about you, but I know when I go to buy something, I'll also, try and get some evidence about, an item like that. I'll try and get some research data about what's a good washing machine versus a bad one. But I'll also look at the reviews, and that's about people telling me how they found that item. And so, most people, I think, when they go shopping, I do quite a lot of online shopping. I live out in the country, and it's a convenient thing for me. And I will often see what people have said about a particular item before I purchase it. In terms, a whole variety of things, quality, fit, or whatever it is. And I think that story is really, isn't it? In many respects, it's a story of how people have found it. It's their experience. It's experiential, word of mouth advertising in terms of a consumer item. But the same thing happens with people and how they relate to you as an organisation or as a not-for-profit. If you're from a not-for-profit, so if you're from a not-for-profit, and there is good word of mouth, good talkability. They're good stories. They're good positive stories, and it's good word of mouth advertising, which is what you're after. In terms of people having experience with what you've done to help them, how they found you as an organisation, how they found you responding to them, a whole range of things that they might provide feedback from on a variety of places, mainly social media, obviously. So, in summary, I think storytelling, is an effective way to deliver information that's more engaging and memorable than simply conveying facts and figures. Storytelling enhances your brand because stories stay with people, I think, and are more likely to be shared by others by word of mouth, and that's very, very true. And do hop in if you have any questions at any stage. Please, very happy to answer them. So Ira Glass, I'm sure most of you or some of you have heard of him. He is the guy that's behind This American Life, which, if anyone has ever listened to that podcast, is a great storytelling podcast most of the time. I mean, sometimes it's reportage, but it's a great storytelling podcast, and they tell the stories from all over the place, mainly in America, but not exclusively. And it's a very good comment. Great stories happen to those who can tell them, and it is very true. We can all have stories. We've all had experiences in our life, but we need to be able to tell those things. We need to be able to extract that story from people we're working with, or the clients that we're working with, or the customers that we're working with. We need to be able to extract those stories and communicate those to others before they become great, before they become things that are convincing others to act or buy or engage. And that's very, very true. For anyone who hasn't listened to This American Life, I certainly would recommend it. It's you can just subscribe to it on the podcast. On one of the variety of apps that you can subscribe to these things, and it's very, very good. It's a good thing to listen to when you're driving. So, what's a story? A story that drives a connection between your brand and your audience. What does it do? If you think about it, someone's just given me some feedback saying that he's great. Ira Glass we're talking about. Yeah, he's a great guy, actually. It's interesting. I heard an interview with Ira Glass with someone else last week, and he played something that he did 20 years ago when he was sort of just a radio journalist, and it was so different. It was very funny. So let's think about stories. Stories that drive a connection between your brand and your audience. Now, what do? They inspire an emotional reaction, wanting people to do something, feel something mainly, really. If you're trying to convince someone, let's just sort of break this down, if you're trying to convince someone to buy something from you or to sign up to a product, they want to feel good about it. They don't want to just go, oh yeah, I'll do that in a sort of very flat, unengaged way. For people to buy something or to spend money on something, they need to feel positive about it. So that's an emotional reaction. It's a story also that drives a connection between you and your brand and your audience, teaches them something new. So it teaches them that you as a not-for-profit have assisted some extraordinary people to do some extraordinary things, or to go through amazing recovery if you're a health-related not-for-profit, or if you're a cancer charity that you've helped people through some tough times. It's those sorts of human stories that drives people to go, this is emotional, but it also teaches them something about what you're doing. If we're talking about a corporate client or a small business or a company, it's teaching them something about what your product does, what it can do, what its potential is. Its potential to achieve something for you, to whatever that might be. So it's teaching something as well. It also can challenge people to think differently. Now, if we're advertising a new brand of coffee, then it may not necessarily be that we're going to be. It's not going to be sort of radically life-changing. It sort of challenges someone's very, very being. But if you think about it, it actually does apply to that even as well. You want them to think differently about what it is you're offering. If it's a product, you want them to think that it is different. It is, changing things up. It is shaking stuff up. It is really challenging them to think that you're doing something differently, something good, something well, if it's a product. If it's a not-for-profit, and if it's something, an organisation that's doing good work, you do want them to think, what is it that you're doing? How is that, achieving something? What's different about what it is you're doing? And so that's, I think, positive too. So we need to think about how to break down and construct the story itself. And, we talk about finding a story and telling a story. That's all great. You can probably identify it. If you're a corporate or a company, a small business, you've obviously let me know if there's any small businesses or companies on the line. You may mainly be not-for-profits. But, if it's a small business, you obviously want to identify someone who is going to be a positive ambassador for your product or your service. If you're a not-for-profit, you're looking for someone who has benefited from what you've done. You want someone to be able to become a really strong third-party supporter for what you're doing. So in many respects, we're talking about a case study here. We're talking about a blog post. We're talking about something that you might make into a video. Obviously, you need to have, you either communicate in the video with a voiceover, or you allow these people to tell their own stories. So whatever it is, whether it's a product, a service, a not-for-profit, a charitable organisation doing good work, really the principles of telling and structuring that story is the same. And let's just go through them. So let's for a moment imagine that we're writing a blog post, or a case study, which would appear ostensibly to be a blog post or some sort of post on your website or your Facebook page, for example. The story is very much the same, and it doesn't have to be long. It might be 200 or 300 words. So, we need to start with an introduction, setting the scene and introducing the people we're talking about. We're not talking about a fictional character here. We're talking about real people, but you're introducing who it is that you're talking about. Now, that story could be in the first person. It could be the person telling the story, or it could be in the third person where someone is telling the story about that person. So, either way, they can jump on and introduce themselves, or you as the third party, you know, voice will tell that story about them. Then we need to, rising action is obviously the next thing that we're wanting to introduce. Now, again, we're not talking about a novel here. I know it sounds like it, but it really is the same principle. Please feel free to go off and write a short story after this. But it's the same principle. We need to introduce, conflict or a tension. Even if it's a product, the tension was solving a problem. The tension was they were looking for something. They were looking for a solution, and they found it with you. It doesn't have to be, a life-threatening conflict, a life-threatening tension, or some sort of. It doesn't have to be as dramatic or as life-altering as being an asylum seeker. It could be if you're doing something domestically. It's something not as dramatic as that, but it's about something that needed to happen, needed to be done, a problem that needed to be solved. So that's what you introduce next. Then the climax, the height of action or the conflict. It's often a turning point for the story. So or this the blog post or however you're expressing it. So what actually happened? What was the thing that was the pivot here? What was it that created? If it's a personal story about how a charity has helped people, what was it that was the sort of dramatic turning point that got you involved with their life, or them turning to you, for example. Then we've got falling action. So that's the resolution or denouement, and really, obviously, it's where we take people, and this could be some couple of paragraphs or some hundreds of words, this section. So it's an explanation of where they've come from that crisis point, or that problem that they've turned to you from, or that moment where they turn to you to give them the solution, to the final outcome. What did you do to help them? How did you work together to solve the problem? What benefit did they have from talking with you, working with you? And then the resolution is the end point of the whole situation. So, not all problems are necessarily solved, but something important is achieved or done, or, you've done some work, they've acknowledged that, they're talking about what happened. So there is some sort of resolution. They've moved forward. They've, you might have sold them a washing machine, or you've helped them with, a service under the new NDIS. It could be a range of things that you've helped them with. Not everything's gone away, but life's better. It's certainly improved. I mean, you're obviously wanting to tell a story that is going to demonstrate that there is some sort of resolution, that you've assisted them moving forward in some direction. And obviously with charitable work and not-for-profit work, life isn't perfect for everyone. That's what we're doing it for. But there's often a move forward, some sort of success, some sort of achievement, because after all, that's what we do it for. Importantly. So then there's the characters. Obviously, we need to think about who these people are in your story. So, you've got to develop complete and consistent characters that justify their inclusion in the story. If they don't contribute to the narrative arc, consider removing them. So what I mean there is, if it's you might be asked by a local paper to write a story for them. You might be asked by a sort of newspaper or specialist publication to write a story for them. It may be something that's a lengthier blog post in a newsletter that you're writing, or in a blog that you've got as part of your website. If the story is about a person, you don't need to necessarily include, everyone in their family. I suppose what we're talking about here, think about how many other characters and other people you embroider into this story, because if you have too many, you obviously lose the focus on that person and their journey and how you've worked with them and how they've come through the other side and life has improved because of the relationship that you've had with them. So it's about really simplifying it, I suppose, and having that strong voice for the sort of the clear person, the center of the central character or the central focus of your post, your story, or the newsletter piece that you've written. So, in terms of pace, we need to think about that. Now, not too fast and not too slow, essentially, is the rule of thumb. And by that, where, if it's a very long post, or, you need to really question the words that you include. So don't just write for the sake of writing. Don't just include facts and sort of beef it out and sort of extend it for no purpose. I think that does slow down the pace of a story and makes it, in some respects, miss the mark in terms of really getting people in, and also keeping them with you. You've got to keep a reader with you when they're reading something. Not too fast is probably too fewer words. You can't really tell a meaningful, strong, emotional story in 100 words. Where you could probably have a go, but you probably couldn't say it in 2 sentences. Certainly, 140 characters in a tweet is hard to do it, but 140 character tweet, which is a taster. And a strong photo might be enough to get people to go link. Obviously you've got to be able to drive them to your site, and so that could be a very strong connection. As a general rule, brevity is better, but to that point, 140 character story really is impossible to do. So you've really got to think about, the pace and sentence structure. Long, monotonous stories, are often ones that people will just, stop reading. A lot of the time, I write a weekly piece for a blog in Canberra called Her Canberra, and it's first person. It's about politics and media, politics in Canberra and women. And I'll just really just do it from the first person, and have moments of where I'm sort of being slightly whimsical and slightly amusing, and then I'll have some serious moments, and then I'll have some factual moments. So I'll sort of bring it up and bring it down. Now sometimes I'll have characters in that story. It's not really a story that I'm telling as such. It's a sort of personal piece from me, but I will include stories from people or reference people. And I think it's just about thinking how you do that and changing that tone, keeping that tone, moving so that it's not always sort of flat and boring. Not that you are intending to write in a flat and boring way, but if you're using facts, if you just talk about facts through the story, people are going to turn off. If you're just speaking in sort of gutsy, simplistic sentences, people will probably turn off. You've sort of got to have this sort of quite, every story will be different, every person's story will be different, every example will be different, but you've got to come to a happy medium. I think you need to be willing to omit details or events that don't contribute to the narrative arc, but always practice your story on someone who hasn't heard it before, I think, to make sure they follow it and it makes sense. Get someone to read it, get someone to just say, yes, they think what you've written is good and it makes sense to them, and you're on the right track. I think that's always helpful. So make sure, in terms of the audience and how the stories will work with the audience, make sure that the characters in your stories are people that your target audience can relate to. So there's not much point in trying to target. If you're talking to a group of families about services that you're running for the new NDIS services, there's no point in sort of talking in a overly academic way or an overly pompous way or overly elitist way, in the sense of, a senior person. The voice for a story would probably be best done in that way from someone who's experienced the services. It could be anyone really, from a single parent through to a family of five, through to an elderly couple, through to a young child. Obviously, the child isn't going to necessarily tell a story, but who's a storyteller? I suppose we talked about ordinary people. We're all ordinary people, really, and it's about how you tell that story. People need to be able to relate to it. So it's about who is going to be reading this story and what do you want them to do as a result of reading the story. And you need to make sure that this story is going to demonstrate, but moreover, activate them to actually do something and take some action. And so you need to make sure that those characters are actually going to do that, and they're going to motivate people. So they need to be able to be relatable. Make sure that that you use language that your target audience can understand. And by that I mean, don't use jargon, don't use professional language, don't use technical language, because by and large you won't have a technical audience. And my rule of thumb is always that people who have got a PhD can read simple language, but people who can only haven't had the benefits of extended years of education can't read technical language. It's not that you have to dumbing it down. You're not talking to you don't have to assume that you're talking to idiots. It's not that. It's about saying something that the majority of people can understand. And I think by and large you can probably express a much more emotional story in simpler, effective language than you can overly jargonistic language. If you think about it, think about the novels that you've read, think about the books that you've read. They don't have to be complex words. They don't have to be lengthy, complex words to be, strong, compelling stories. In terms of a story, in terms of being able to use stories for blogs, for social media, for newsletters, etc., it's always useful to have photographs involved. And photographs help illustrate a story and help create a memorable impression on on the audience. Remember that people connect to images just as much as they connect to words themselves. And there's some amazing statistics. It's something like 70 or 80% of people will click on a post that's got it's got a strong strong photograph, as opposed to ones that don't. And I think we've all known that for a while. If you're not using photographs to accompany your posts and your stories and your newsletter pieces, then think about starting to do that. I think it's really important. And they need to be interesting, photographs, rather than sort of stock ones that you may, find sort of randomly, or something that you've downloaded illegally from the internet. It needs to be a photograph that's either going to be, what's that? That's interesting, or, it tells a story. It tells a passionate story from just reading it, from looking at the photo. My husband's a photographer with Fairfax. Andrew Mears is his name. Some of you may know him. And so I'm, we're sort of a photographic aware family. But it's amazing. He takes a lot of the time photos in question time in Parliament House in Canberra, and he can, obviously tell, the purpose of what he does is obviously try to tell a story through a photograph. And so quite often, photographs of politicians, tell a story of, moments of despair, moments of hilarity, moments of joy, moments of anger. And that's a great tool to be able to be used for any of the photographs that accompany what you're writing as well. Show, don't tell, I think, is important. So, help the reader to experience the story through action. Words, thoughts, senses, and feelings, rather than through expositions, summaries or descriptions. So, I think what I mean there is, if you're thinking about telling a story about how you've worked with someone around a service, or you've helped with someone through a hard time, a difficult period in their life, You can talk about, it in a sort of technical, um, sterile way, or you can talk about it in a real human way, talking about the action, talking about the thoughts that they were feeling, talking about the thoughts that you felt in terms of helping them, the senses that they had, their feelings, rather than just sort of summarizing simply what it is you did. We helped them for 5 years whilst they were going through chemotherapy, or whatever you want to say. Wouldn't it be better expressed? We were there holding John's hand, while he was going through whatever. So it's about touching people, about when you're using those words, they can actually feel and sense and visualize what it is you're saying, rather than a sort of sterile description, if you like, of what it is that you've done. I think that's really important. And we're about 4 or 5 slides before we finish. So if anyone's got any questions, please do pop in and ask. We're probably about 5-10 minutes away from finishing. So what kind of stories can you share? Well, stories about your customers or clients, how your business organization has worked with them and helped them. Obviously, we've talked about that. Stories about your organization's businesses, your principles and your values and how they are established. So that might be a story about, one of the clients we've worked with has been Go Guides, and there's some amazing stories about people who've worked tirelessly. And for those of you, and most of you, I think, are working in not-for-profits, you'll have similar examples of people who've worked tirelessly for the organisation for many, many years. If it's a voluntary organisation, you will have people that have worked tirelessly. I'm on the board of Hockey ACT in Canberra, and there are people who've been involved with the organisation for a long, long time, and have worked tirelessly for a long time for the organisation. So it's telling stories about them, and respecting them, and allowing them to tell those stories can inspire all sorts of people, parents, young people, whoever that is. I think it is a really good use. Someone just asked me a question. Can you please explain how you might adapt your story if given verbally as opposed to a blog or a post? So do you mean like a podcast or a recording, a video? I'm assuming that's what you're probably saying, Gary. I think what I'd say there in terms of an oral history or an oral story is you can do a story in a video just as easily. Obviously people don't want to be listening unless you're a really good videographer or a really good filmmaker. That's what Gary's meaning. You probably have to do it, in a truncated way. You have to do it in a more impactful way. You have to obviously probably have some idea of what you're doing. Not necessarily so. I mean, there's whole film festivals of films that are made and edited on iPhones. It's entirely possible to do something simple on an iPhone that doesn't have to be extraordinary. And it is about the story. So, I think probably the first person is important there. I think getting them to tell it in their own words, I think, is a really important thing. And if you've got a great editor or a great team around you, you can obviously do something a bit more complicated, but you can equally do something on an iPhone that you can use in a blog post. And I would probably look at keeping it a little shorter, because there's nothing worse than clicking onto something on a social media site and working out at 7 minutes, and people will just click off. And so I think keeping it to 30, 60 seconds is probably a better thing in terms of trying to get people involved if you're using those links on social media. If you've got a longer video that you want to deploy on a website, I'd go right ahead and do it. I think, and I'm not saying gone are the days where you can no longer use longer videos. I think you can, but I think for the purposes of engaging with audiences, getting them to activate, getting them to do what you want, I really do think that probably the a shorter video is probably going to be more effective for you. Stories about, just getting back for a moment, about the stories that you can share, stories about the evolution of your business or organization. And again, how have you come from nowhere to create something great? I've worked with a couple of organizations that have started very, very small and expanded with great success. And they've, done it through sheer audacity, really hard work, really absolutely being committed to what their whole purpose has been. And, telling that story in and of itself has been inspiring. And I've actually done a number of conference appearances with one particular charity called the Jodie Lee Foundation, who is a bowel cancer awareness charity. And Nick Lee, his personal story about his wife who passed away from bowel cancer with no prior family history or symptoms is a very, very strong and compelling personal story. He will combine the personal story about what happened to him and his family, and then talk about that and develop that, and then say, so what did we do? What did we decide to do? What did I decide to do out of this? Well, this is what I've decided to do. I've created, I've spent every waking moment working on bowel cancer awareness from that moment, rather than sort of giving up and going, oh, I'm just going to go back to work. He actually gave up his day job and created a charity, and he was nominated for South Australian of the Year and was a finalist, and is a great, great man, and has got, $3 or $4 million of funding from the federal government. So, telling those sorts of stories in a video sense, or in a blog post, or in a newsletter piece, or in a longer form story, can work really, really well. And I think that's those sorts of personal stories of growth, commitment, sheer audacity, just the effort that you put in to come from nowhere, to come to something good, I think they're great stories, and they should definitely be used. The link between the story and your business or your organization doesn't have to be obvious, and it doesn't have to be integral to the story. Obviously, a lot of the time I'm advising clients about, people will think that they can write an op-ed for a major national newspaper, and it can be all about their service. Well, you can imagine how many national newspapers will want to publish a story which is a promotion piece. They won't do it. But what they will do is they will allow someone to talk about, in the third person or in the first person about a particular experience or a particular learning experience. I mean, they usually need to be experts in a particular area, but they can also weave in personal stories into those sorts of op-eds. And that's when you're really getting serious with stories, when you can create something that you can then submit to a national newspaper and then get it run. Obviously, that's the sort of high end of where you want to get to. But, we often get, stories and pieces printed in national papers very, very frequently. And sometimes, or blogs like Women's Agenda or a variety of other blogs. And a lot of the time they're interested in those first-person stories. They're not interested in, this is me and I work for X and X is great and X does this and X is this. It's about the personal story, because they're not, if you're trying to sell a story into an outside blog or an outside newspaper or an online platform, they're going to see right through you doing a promotional piece. They won't take it. They won't be interested, and they won't come back to you. They won't consider probably talking to you again. Probably you've got to be very, 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 very diplomatic about how you feature what you do and who you are, and that's what I mean by not being obvious. I think that the more subtle it is, the better it can go. And the other thing I think it also does is it achieves, a op-ed is a much better tool for people believing you than a paid advertorial, because it's very clear that one, you've paid for, The other is printed because the newspaper thinks you've got credibility to be there. And so, the more subtle you are, the more runs on the board you get, the more print, inches or, computer blog posts online that you get, the more credible that you'll be as a consequence. And that's coming from the subtlety of how you can do that. Have a look at, if I'm sure there's lots of men online, but have a look at a post, have a look at an a website like Women's Agenda. They feature not-for-profit or other inspirational business women every day and their personal stories. Now, if you're reading a post from the chair of a board of a particular company or the CEO of a particular company, she's not going to be promoting her company and the product. If she's from a bank, she's not going to say, well, come in and we'll give you the best home loan rate. What she's talking about is the particular culture that she's tried to create at the organisation, or her personal story that she's got 3 kids and it's been tough, or whatever it is. She's come from the wrong side of the railway tracks, or whatever it is. She grew up poor and whatever. It's a personal story that helps drive you to then think, the next time you're trying to make a decision about a bank, you might go, oh, I remember reading about that CEO of that bank and she sounds really interesting, or whatever it is. And so it's that subtlety, it's those subtle connections that will then drive people to have a really good, strong recollection and a strong, feeling about what it is you're doing. So where can you tell your stories? Obviously, there's a variety of places that you can deploy them: on your blog, on your website's about page, straight up, and that can lead to as a link to somewhere longer, or it can just be there that you've got a really simple story at the front. On social media, in words, in pictures, and in videos, it might just be that you have a photo montage that tells the story. It doesn't necessarily have to be in words. It can connect to a longer caption, for example. As we talked about before, it can be a video, it can be in a media release, in newsletters. You can tell stories, as I just mentioned before, that I've seen very successfully used at conferences, and at speaking events. I do a lot of speaking, and I often will use, either with approval or obliquely, references to work that I've done and clients that I've worked with, and sometimes or politicians that we've gone to speak to, and some of those stories are funny, and some of those stories are sad, and some of those stories might elicit a laugh or elicit something else. And that's what I try to achieve when I'm talking, weaving in some of those things when you're speaking, and at conferences is a really useful way of deploying stories as well. If there's any more questions, please pop in, because we're about to finish. The next webinar is on Tuesday the 16th of August, 11 a.m. Augmented reality, what the heck is Pokemon Go, and is it important? I'm going to try and get a bit of a lesson or two from my son. I do have it on my phone. My daughter was using it over the weekend, but this is much more than talking about Pokemon Go. There's a whole lot of ways that people are using augmented reality in a broad sense, in terms of marketing in corporates, and using it for not-for-profit campaigning and marketing and PR. So we're going to explore all that in the next webinar. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's been good to have you, and hope you have a great day. And it's been lovely to speak with you. So thank you so much.